This content is brought to you by Uphold, which makes crypto investing easy. I've been a user of Uphold since 2017. They're one of my go-to exchanges. You can buy, sell, and trade cryptocurrencies on Uphold. You can also trade precious metals and equities. They have 10 plus million users, 250 plus cryptocurrencies, and they're available in 150 countries. As with all exchanges, you can buy and sell on them, but I highly recommend you custody your own crypto. Not your keys, not your coins. If you'd like to learn more about Uphold, please visit the link in the description. Welcome back to the Thinking Crypto podcast, your home for cryptocurrency news and interviews. With me today is Brock Pierce, who's an entrepreneur, venture capitalist, co-founder of Tether and Blockone, a former presidential candidate, and a former child actor. Brock, it's an honor to have you on the podcast.
Well, I'm grateful to connect with you, and thank you for spreading the good word and going through the process of asking interesting people questions for the benefit of others. It's such an important thing today. I mean, look at what we've gone through in terms of major media companies, censorship, certainly for those of us working on censorship resistant technologies, kind of the importance of where are you getting your information from? As much as we're building trustless systems, trust is still a critical component of everything we're building here. There are still people involved.
For sure. And Brock, you were the pioneer for many great crypto solutions. You're obviously involved with many different companies, but I want to get to know you a bit better, outside of the Wikipedia stuff, where you're from and where'd you grow up?
Well, I was made and born in Minnesota, right outside of Minneapolis, in a small town called St. Louis Park. I started acting at the age of 3.
Wow.
And I started making my first movies at the age of 10, and then ended up moving out to California as a result of having done Mighty Ducks and a bunch of the local films in Minnesota, then moving out to Los Angeles temporarily to film Mighty Ducks 2. I ended up moving to Southern California, or to Hollywood, when I was 13, just turned 13 years old.
And what made you transition from acting, leaving Hollywood, to go into tech and investing?
Well, I come from the first generation of kids that, generally grew up with video games in the home, the beginning of sort of computers, home computers, the beginning of sort of the consumer internet. Your Prodigies, or even the school systems in the US were distributing some of this stuff, to the AOLs. And so I'm a byproduct of the first generation that had access to tech, as kids. And so it was obvious to me that technology was going to play an important role in our future. And so I grew up starring in movies. I decided I didn't like being famous and, going out places and everyone wanting to take their picture with you, sign an autograph. It's like, anonymity, is, an incredible form of privacy. Being a movie star is, complicated. And so, and I also was like, I'm busy reading other people's lines. I want to be the creator. I want to be the producer. I want to be the person that makes and invents the things. And so I just decided I didn't want to act anymore. I still did it for a little while as I was figuring out what I wanted to do next. And when I was 16, I made the final decision to quit acting and pursue an entrepreneurial sort of internet career. At the time, everybody thought I was crazy. They're like, what university did you graduate from? What are your qualifications? What makes you think that you can go start a business? And, because at the time there were no teenagers. I'm pretty sure the youngest internet entrepreneur there is, at the time, back then, if you didn't graduate from the right fraternity, you couldn't access capital. It was far more a club then, and it was that internet, the wave of the internet is really what kind of opened up the market for entrepreneurs that didn't, come through sort of your conventional path, which in many ways has paved the way for those of us that work in, call it blockchain or cryptocurrency technologies, but a bunch of industries, and so that's how I made that transition. And my first business, having come from entertainment, was a focus on streaming video. And so started a company that was really the precursor to YouTube, Netflix, Hulu.
Wow.
We raised $88 million from, NBC and Intel and Microsoft and Chase and Lazard and, all your big companies. And we pioneered the terminology like webisode, the format of your 5 to 6 minute sort of episodes. We pioneered most of this stuff. It was back in 1997. There was another company out of New York called pseudo.com that Josh Harris had started, and he did a lot of things like Operator 11. And so those were kind of your precursors to kind of all of what you'd call streaming today. Then you had a thing called pop.com that came along, Richard Baskin Robbins sort of family, Entertainer. And these were all your companies in the 90s that pioneered this stuff. Now, when the internet bubble burst in the spring of 2000, kind of 99 out of 100 businesses failed.
Right.
If you thought you've been through a crypto bear market, you have no idea what that was like. I mean, literally, if you worked at a venture capital firm or an investment firm and you even mentioned the internet, you might be fired. People had been so burned. Imagine if you took FTX, Mt. Gox, Terra Luna, Celsius, BlockFi, and 100 other hacks and failed businesses in the space, and you turn that all into one singular event, what kind of market we would live through. And that's effectively when 99% of everything imploded. People were just like, it didn't even matter that public companies like eBay were profitable and trading below cash. Every company that was like in the public markets was trading below cash. The internet was valued at zero, even though basically the metrics of usage continued to be up and to the right. As a market, it was dead.
Yeah, I remember seeing the Amazon chart and their stock down 80%, if that's correct. And
yes, if we pull up the chart right now, it's more than that. I think it's a lot more than that.
Yeah. So Brock, you've been involved in so many different companies as an entrepreneur. What are you most proud of when you look back, crypto, Web 1, Web 2, whatever it may be? What are you most proud of as far as investment and a company that you built?
Well, I mean, I think the things to me that I find most interesting is, if you've invented industry, right? I like to think of myself as someone that is not confined by the box, right? I live outside of the box. I'm not confined to reality as it currently is. Right. I see the world for what it can be, and as a result of having that kind of ability to see around corners or over hills, and in terms of having the imagination, to dream of a world that is different than the one that we currently, are in right now. And then the ability to help others realize that dream or see it enough to the point that we're able to build it and then be it, right? And then here we are. Those are always the fascinating things. Whether I'm proud of having the foresight, right, to be able to see and do those things. That's really proud. I mean, I measure my success in life by the impact I have on the world around me. So a lot of the things I'm most impressed by are the things that you may not be. It's actually the little things. It's the basic things too. That this is real for everybody. It kind of goes back to G.I. Joe, whatever, showing up.
Sure.
The thing that I'm most proud of is my tenacity to get up over and over and over again and show up and serve to the best of my abilities to try and, contribute to building a better world. And so that's a little thing that all of us can do, right? Showing up is at least half, maybe 90% of kind of what makes everything we do possible. And so, that I think is, something that I credit myself with. I don't really credit my successes, to me, right? There's a lot of factors or variables that contribute to my successes, and to overly take credit is me. It's a we thing, I play my part and contribute, in the ways that I can, and not all of it good, right? I'm doing my best and every day get better.
Well, it sounds like you appreciate the journey more than the rewards, and you've obviously had a lot of success, but you love looking at, like you said, thinking outside the box, being a visionary. What's the next way we can improve the lives of people and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what matters. Like I think of life a little bit like a game, right? The game of life. And the default game that most people are playing, not because they chose to, but because they were kind of told to, they've been programmed to believe that it's about the pursuit of, wealth or power. I've gone into the options menu of life and chosen to play a different game, the game of impact. I don't measure my success by what I have or even what I've done, but by the impact, positive impact that I've had on the world. Like at the end of our life, as we think about our legacy and what did we do with the time, this precious time, this gift that we've been given, to be here and to be able to affect the world around us. Did I do the right thing? Did I leave it better than I found it? Did I inspire people to be their best selves? Did I lead by example? Was I a good influence? Was I a good teacher? Was I a good father? These are the things that are universal, right? This is where a bridge can be built between any of us, because these are the common things. Then what we choose, in terms of the journey and what we do in our life, those are the things where, often back to Japanese concepts, ikigai, figuring out what you're passionate about, what you love, what you're good at, and what the world needs. And thank God we're all different. Like life would be boring if we were all doing the same thing, and the world needs a lot of diversity. It needs a lot of variety, to co-create, this fascinating place in which we get to live and, exist.
For sure. So tell us about your journey in discovering Bitcoin, and what was your aha moment?
Well, it goes back to the 90s, right? I video games. Sure. I was a great gamer, professional gamer, effectively, of that time period. And I also had been, collecting, collectibles, trading items, Magic the Gathering cards, things of that nature. And there was a game that came out called Sanctum from a company called Digital Addiction. And it was basically like Magic the Gathering meets chess online. And so I became the largest kind of online store, buying and selling these, collectible cards, and built a real business. And it was in that moment that I had I came to the insight, the awareness that just because something was intangible didn't make it less valuable. Sure. So this is going back to the 1990s.
Right.
So as massively multiplayer games emerged, virtual worlds, today what we would call a metaverse, I recognized that the digital currency and the digital assets inside of those persistent worlds had value. And I became the main market maker in the world. I had over 90% market share in South Korea, and it was that team that went on to build most of the cryptocurrency, or much of the cryptocurrency industry and infrastructure in South Korea. I ran most of the Chinese markets in terms of where production was. We had about 400,000 people in China playing, living in these metaverses and working professionally to mine digital assets. Built the first television channel over there, was instrumental in the launch of Alipay and the payment systems for Jack Ma. I was PayPal's largest merchant for years, so cross-border transactions and things of that nature was something that I'd been very familiar with. I was by far the biggest player in Europe, and by far in the Americas, dominating North America for a very long time. And so this is, again, a lot of the precursor to cryptocurrency, right? And so to me, it was kind of inevitable that I would end up in sure. Bitcoin. Bitcoin is, actually, it was in, October 31st, right? 2008 is when the white paper was published. Right. And then January, the first block was mined. And it was actually in the December 2008 issue of Wired that, it calls me the godfather of digital currency, which, so I was obviously in this business long before Bitcoin.
So Brock, I got to ask then, are you Satoshi?
We're all, Satoshi is really an idea to me more than anything else. Sure. And successes have many parents or fathers, right? We all stand on the shoulders of giants. And so there are many that have contributed to this work and Bitcoin being possible, whether they, call it would be in that team of Satoshi, right? Or individual, many contributed to the learning that made Bitcoin possible. And many have contributed to Bitcoin's success. And what we have is Bitcoin today being possible. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also helpful, to have an anonymous sort of creator.
Yeah.
Because if people knew or who had or they that did this, you'd find out that all human beings are flawed.
For sure.
Sometimes the heroes are just left the way it is, and many of us have contributed to the success of this, and so I tend to like the more the we are legion, right? We are all Satoshi. It's kind of like the what would Jesus do stuff.
So Brock, I mean, to your point, the anonymity is a great feature of Bitcoin, not knowing, and the fact that it's decentralized, anybody can tap into the network and mine Bitcoin. And we've seen Bitcoin get huge adoption and growth, obviously in price, but just in folks recognizing it as currency, digital gold, whatever it may be. And now you have the biggest Wall Street giants here, BlackRock, and all these folks want a Bitcoin spot ETF. As a crypto OG, looking back to when you first discovered Bitcoin, were we seeing the inevitable that everyone is going to have to participate on the Bitcoin blockchain at some point?
I mean, I'm not sure everybody will have to. I think the future is, what we co-create. And I'm not sure that it's a singular future. In the same way that you've got a number of religions, right? You have multiple credit card options. You've got multiple nation states. I'm not sure that it has to end up as a singular future. Bitcoin is certainly the alpha. Or the beta. We want to stick to these. But we'll see. Obviously Bitcoin is the first and that which has really found its use case, right? It's found its role in being that sort of digital gold, that sort of digital commodity that at a time where there's so much financial uncertainty, in the world, the people are looking for systems that they can trust because they're very concerned about the decisions that are being made with our, call it monetary policy around the world.
Yeah.
And there are clearly some that have seen Bitcoin as a more interesting alternative than gold for a number of reasons. The idea that it's infinitely or near infinitely divisible, right? You can't counterfeit it. It's from a transportability perspective, you can send it everywhere. Those things that its intangibility may be positive attributes in terms of its features. And so Bitcoin has clearly found a very compelling role, I think, in the world. It's obviously, doing quite well by my standards. And we'll see what happens through this sort of next wave. We have a halvening coming up again, clearly a lot of financial uncertainty in the world. Do we see a $300,000 Bitcoin? I think the answer is most likely. Obviously there's questions around quantum computing, and there are still, things where, there are still reasons why things may not go as they appear. Again, sure. Try not to overly state what the future holds.
Yeah, and there's certainly going to be challenges. And what we've seen, though, so far, the history of Bitcoin is all those different challenges that come up, people forking it, attacks, whatever it may be, it has become stronger. But to your point, we're entering a new era with AI, quantum computing, and so forth, and it's going to face some new challenges there. With that said, we're seeing countries like El Salvador making it a legal tender. I personally think central banks at some point may start putting it on their balance sheet the same way they do gold. Do you agree with that thesis?
Well, I not only agree, they are. Right? This is not speculation. It's happening. I spend a lot of time talking to governments and heads of state and legislatures and regulators and central banks around the world. I'm dealing with probably roughly 50 countries right now. I've gotten involved in terms of a role within the United Nations and a permanent mission as a delegate, as well as started my own organization. Doing that, I was involved in El Salvador, and we led the one of my organizations. It's called the United Council of Rising Nations, or unicorn.org, is there to basically talk to world leaders and say, tell us your problems, and let's see, as entrepreneurs, innovators, what solutions we may have for the world. And this is not just a crypto conversation. We look at all your underlying infrastructure, whether it be water, food security, energy, telecom, financial inclusion, things like your central bank and what that balance sheet might look like. We're willing to look at anything. I'm personally of the view that we live in a time where there are so many, call it, challenges that we face as a civilization. Challenges meaning opportunities. Opportunities to overcome, these things. And so there's some great challenges to be had. And as someone that likes to solve, really hard problems or solve puzzles, and it's a fun thing to do. And I think most of our answers are going to come from innovators, right? Those of us on the forefront of innovation, but also those of us that, study history, right? That look backwards. I think there's a lot of ancient wisdom in the world that may also shed light or provide insights into solutions as well. I don't think it's all, call it future. I think some of it is also coming from the past.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Tell us about the Bitcoin Foundation. You're obviously doing some work there, and the mission, is that kind of what you're alluding to with some of the work you're doing globally?
No, the Bitcoin Foundation is kind of a half joke, in the sense that I got elected to the Bitcoin Foundation. So the Bitcoin Foundation is the oldest organization in crypto, right? It's the original organization that was formed by a lot of the largest contributors to Bitcoin early on to create a channel that media could contact Bitcoin. It's decentralized, right? So who do you contact? It was meant to do that, to talk to governments, things of that nature. But it also was financing most of the early development and things of that nature. And there were some issues. And I, had been persuaded by many friends in the industry to take a position on the board and attempt to solve some of the challenges there. The main one was the people were concerned it was becoming, call it, too influential, too powerful. Too much centralization in around an ecosystem that is meant to be decentralized. And so we effectively distributed most of the authority of that organization by moving, call it, core development to MIT, and then it went beyond that. There's many organizations now that are doing, call it, some of that government lobbying and trade sort of association type of work. You've got a bunch that are doing all the conferences, lots of conference organizations that are creating and facilitating gatherings around the world for people to learn and connect. Through each bear cycle, those businesses, we lose a few and a few new ones emerge. And so the Bitcoin Foundation's role by design was diminished. Now, a lot of, call it, elders and, OG type of players, we've been talking about there's certain things that organization is well suited to do again. And so you might see something interesting. Part of the problem is I'm involved in so many projects. It's like, what title do I wish to go by? Sure. There's just so many. And so I tend to prefer to just go by my name. But, in the context of crypto, it's kind of innocuous.
Sure. So, Brock, we got to talk Tether. You're one of the co-founders, an incredible invention, if you want to call it that. How did the idea Tether and building a stable coin come about, and Tether being the largest stable coin in the market, and birthed it out, just more stable coins and the idea of tokenization and so forth. Tell us about that.
Well, there's a few things. One is Mastercoin was the first ICO. So Mastercoin is where the ICO was created. That really was the summer of 2013. And so me and a couple of my partners were the, kind of one of the main contributors to the resources necessary to build out that protocol, which is a layer 2 on top of Bitcoin. This is during the time of counterparty and color coins as well. If you're, how well your history in terms of this industry's development, and the first to tokenize that. And so Craig Sellers, who's actually here with me, I'm in Spain right now, we're in Ibiza. Craig Sellers was CTO of Mastercoin. And so I, having had a background in, PayPal and a lot of these sort of payment services, it seemed kind of obvious to me that 2/3 of the planet was on or underbanked, had limited access to financial services, and then you've got money remittance and all these cross-border transactional issues. Again, I was very involved in cross-border transactions. It seemed obvious that this is one of the best use cases for this type of technology. And so one of the things is, the people in Argentina, where they're having, sort of their central bank failing on a regular basis, they weren't interested in Bitcoin. They were interested in US dollars.
Right.
And so rather than trying to persuade all these people to become interested in Bitcoin, why not we use the technology that enables Bitcoin, the operating system for Bitcoin, to bring them what they want? So effectively, in a crypto wallet, you have US dollars. Oh, and access to Bitcoin. But it seemed kind of obvious to me. And so Craig and I talked about doing that. And then I recruited a friend of mine, Reeve Collins, to be CEO of it. And then found out shortly thereafter that Bitfinex was working on a similar idea. And so, kind of picked up the phone and we decided the principals at Bitfinex to do it together rather than individually. And so it was basically the three of us and kind of the three of them, and we decided to co-collaborate. I brought in a dev team that was Ukrainian, that had made a Holy wallet, or what was called Holy transaction, out of plug and play. They were a dev team that had come over to the Bay Area and it wasn't working. And so they had come down to LA. I was creating a new company every 30, 60, 90 days out of my kind of incubator. And so that was a dev team kind of figuring out where to be plugged in. I said, Craig, here you go. And so they engineered most of it. Our side was responsible for all sort of product development. We also had a majority of the ownership in the beginning. And then I just kind of had, call it a premonition that this would be my Achilles heel one day. This is really disruptive and my name's all over it, kind of as, call it a father of sorts. And though I was never on the board and I was never an officer, so I wasn't a director or an officer, but that was true of almost every company that I co-founded. I specifically did not want to be in control or in charge or liable for the things we were creating.
I mean, to your point, incredibly disruptive. And now you have the central banks and the governments taking that idea and building CBDCs. I mean, right? Everybody's looking to tokenize on the blockchain. It seems like everything is going to be running on the blockchain. Real estate, securities, everything is going to be tokenized. So do you look back and on Tether and are you like, wow, I mean, it's huge. And there's also a lot of attacks on it, a lot of FUD. What are your thoughts on the whole situation?
Well, in the original business plan, all of these ideas and size and governments and central banks, it was all in the original plan. So nothing surprising there. That's exactly what was clearly identified as what could happen if successful. And it achieved the scale that it kind of needed to be really successful. And so not surprised by any of that, FUD or I mean, if you've been in crypto, there's a lot of, kind of attacks, and kind of everybody is attacking everybody. And so when you're call it king of the hill, when you're the most successful in a particular vertical, you're going to get a lot of flack from a lot of people. The question is it true or not? Right. I'd say one of the things that Tether has done a poor job of is public relations and communications. And so because they've done a poor job of communicating and they've done a poor job on PR, I think that makes them more vulnerable to criticism. And so the question is, how much of that is true? I know the organization quite well. There are some true things there. The bank had a bunch of assets frozen. They lent money from Tether to Bitfinex, and that wasn't disclosed correctly. And that's true. And probably should have done things differently there. But then some of the other accusations that are made, I think, are fabricated or potentially even very substantial exaggerations. And so this is where we have to be discerning individually, and there's strong economic incentives for people to spend money to attack each other. There is a side of this industry that does what I'd call fairly low integrity things.
Yeah, and there's tons of people shorting and doing all kinds of things, like you said, right? So on the note of CBDCs, because you mentioned, this was something you guys had in your idea and your roadmap, that if successful, you could see governments do this. A lot of people are concerned about privacy and how central bank digital currencies could be used against them by draconian governments, let's say, right? Like a lot of people don't like the digital yuan, but they're worried, will the Fed get the digital dollar right? What are your thoughts on that situation and the concerns?
Well, let's start with a different technology. Let's start with electricity. Electricity can be used to create light or to give you a warm blanket. It can also be used to power an electric chair.
Yeah.
Nuclear technology, right? Technologies inherently are amoral. They're neither good or bad. How we use them determines the impact they have. Right. So that's really up to us. And I think it's important right there to just say something is bad is not to have actually given real thought to it. And so the question is, what is the implementation? Is it a CBDC in the fashion that people have heard about China with social credit scores and all these sorts of things that create more of a 1984 type of future? A lot of us that are in this industry obviously care deeply about liberty and freedom.
Right.
One of the things that has attracted us to this, or at least many of us, and a place from a principles perspective, these are the things, something we care about. And one of the things that motivates us to work on this stuff. So clearly, I don't think we want a future that is without any privacy. And so that all depends on us. Why did I run for president of the United States? Why have I gotten involved with governments all over the world? Why do I spend time I probably spend more time in Congress talking to legislators in the US than anyone I'm aware of. I don't think there is anybody spending more time walking the halls of Congress with, that isn't a lobbyist, that is someone that actually does this type of work. Why do I do that? Because I care about the decisions we make. And I would like to see us make the best decisions possible that supports a world in which we wish to live. Working on a project with Craig, who's here as well, and Phil Potter, who is one of the other co-founders of Tether and Bitfinex, a project called Self. We're working on self-sovereign identity systems. CBDCs is finance, right? Money, transactions, credit, all sorts of things around finance. Underneath that, as you think about, call it the foundation of the world in which we live, our identities might be an even more baseline protocol. Who am I? Right? What is my identity? Who owns my identity? What are the attributions of my identity? We don't talk about this very much because you haven't seen a very successful example of it. But if we're talking about self-sovereignty, if we're talking about a world of liberty and freedom, identity is core to, as we pour the cement of the future, world that we want to build. That foundation, this stuff's very important. Identity done wrong can create a world where we're, entirely enslaved in the future, or one where, we've got a lot of liberty. It's like a holy grail type issue. CBDCs and how they get developed matter. And so I talk to governments about this stuff. So that depends on us. It's one of the reasons I would encourage you to get involved in government, right? I think the innovators of the world and the people that support that innovation, people that consciously choose what kind of world they want to live in and support those things, whether it be just how they transact, with whom they transact, when they take out their wallet, who do they give their money to? You're giving power to something, right? Where do we contribute our time to? Where do we use our words? What do we talk about? As we talk about the world in which we wish to live, support it, spend money on it, all those things, that's the world we get. So it's important for us to take the time to be informed so that we can choose the world we want to live rather than be told.
For sure.
What kind of we're going to live in. I want us to make conscious, free-thinking choices.
And I've seen photos of you walking the halls of Congress and so forth. So I certainly appreciate you, because there's a lot of advocacy and education that's needed. We're seeing a lot of it play out with bills and regulations that are trying to be pushed through. Are you planning to run for president again? I mean, it seems like the landscape is changing where it's smarter, tech-focused folks. You look at Vivek Ramaswamy, regardless of political party, it would be like a great time for you to come back in and, the change of the guard a bit.
I'm very involved.
Okay.
I'm paying attention. I've not declared, nor am I running for office right now, though I'm always running on behalf of all of us. The question is to where and what role am I operating in? And so I care deeply. I'm an independent. I'm not on any one side. I think there's only one side ultimately, which is our side, all of us. I don't subscribe to the duality or the polarized world of just 0 and 1 entirely. I believe there's a lot of in between. I may be wrong, but I choose the middle way. I believe, like, take America, Republicans and Democrats, red, blue. It's a Venn diagram that mostly overlaps. And I think as long as we continue to identify as something different than others, we're going to continue to draw lines in the sand. And, so I work closely with Democrats. I work closely with Republicans. I work closely with everybody, because I ultimately think, we're going to win together or lose together. And I support a future in which we win collectively. And then I have my view of the principles and things that I care about, the stuff that I want to see included in that future, things like privacy and liberty, and the list goes on. But and that's what I contribute. And one of the reasons why it's important more of us get involved, right? The future is going to happen to you, or it's going to happen with you. So get involved so that we can co-create that future we want to live in.
I'm in full agreement. That's how I view America and the policies. A lot of folks are divided. It's left, right. And I'm like, well, I kind of like what both party has to say on certain issues. And I'm not necessarily, I'm not wearing my party affiliation on my sleeve, I want to ask you about crypto regulations, because you've been talking to a lot of folks in Congress. Just last week, we had 2 bills make it further than any crypto bills in the history of the crypto industry. They got marked up in the House and approved. What are you hearing? And, are you optimistic that we can possibly get something passed through this year or next year before the election cycle?
I mean, we'll see. We've got a split House Senate, right? So there are, and we're moving into presidential sort of election season, right? We're in the beginning of the primary sort of phase, but we're in this. So we'll see, does stuff get through or not? In the middle of this too, we had a major banking crisis, with banks imploding, which is a bigger deal than crypto issues, though there are some real crypto issues. I'm embarrassed. Sure. As someone that has been such an evangelist for so long, putting my, sort of reputation on the line as I call it a futurist, or someone that, has insight. There's a lot to be embarrassed about, whether it be all those companies that we've talked about that have failed, and call it not quite having all the traction for the money that's come in, and a lot of, I'd say questionable sort of behavior and reputational issues that have come from us. Hasn't changed my conviction of where we're going. and my fundamental belief in these technologies, we've had a lot of really embarrassing mishaps.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Last year was
and last year in particular. And that's, as we talk about regulation, where is it coming from? It's called because we continually screw up. The politicians, are responding to, the headlines that we've created.
Yeah.
Maybe not us individually, but by not identifying problems earlier, allowing, people by the millions to get hurt. These are the things that how government responds. So I hope we just get sensible regulations if regulations happen, right? Because regulations are neither good or bad, to some degree as well. Are these sensible regulations or bad regulation? And one of the things we have right now is regulation by enforcement.
Yeah.
What the SEC has been doing, I'd rather have some sensible regulations than an SEC acting the way that they are. So it's, again, back to not binary. It's not simple of good, bad, this, that, yes, no. It's nuanced. Right. And so some sensible regulation that takes away power from, an SEC that is regulating by enforcement, by empowering, the CFTC, that might not be a bad thing, So we'll see. And again, another reason to be involved. Not everyone, we don't all have to make this our mission, but, again, it's unclear. I think that I like the people that are leading, the legislative and, proposing the bills. These are people that have been strong advocates for us, spending time in our events, learning what we do. It's a coalition, a bipartisan supported bill. Those are all good things, And so we'll see inside of the, on Capitol Hill, sometimes what goes in comes out very differently, right? As legislation gets reviewed. So what sort of like, pork barrels, how does this pig get stuffed? So, I think it's important we pay attention. I think it's important that we vote, if you're an American, and by the way, this is going to matter. Like, I think a lot of us in crypto are single issue voters. There are a lot of people. I mean, look at what's going on with RFK Jr. or Bobby Kennedy.
Yeah. I was about to bring it up. Yeah. What do you think about the political candidates? It's crypto is a ballot item.
Yeah. I mean, we have two presidential candidates that are really all, talking really supportive of what we represent. Bobby Kennedy, obviously on the Democratic ticket, has been really out there and making some big, bold statements.
Yeah.
In terms of crypto is taxed. If you haven't looked and you're someone that cares about this issue, you should look into him. And then obviously, the first sort of, kind of the mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez, running on the Republican ticket, has also been a big advocate for, Bitcoin. And, so we're starting to have an impact and our presence is felt. I was also at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Mm-hmm. And when the president was giving his, sort of speech, he talked about NFTs, I think, as much as he talked about Tucker Carlson. You'll have to go back and look at it, but it's like we were a substantial part of the president's speech. Yeah. If you want to know whether or not you've made it, right? If Moby's gone, mainstream, when you've made it to the presidential White House Correspondents' speech, this is like Saturday Night Live, all of these things. We've entered the zeitgeist of, call it the general public consciousness. It's not all of us that are early adopters. Like, I'd say those are positive things, even if it's meant in a comedic sort of, sensational negative statement. You're there, like all press is good press kind of thing. So I don't want to say this is definitively good or bad because we don't know yet. But I'd say there's some really good things in terms of who's proposed the legislation, how things are happening, why it's, occurring, and that, hopefully we get, sensible, positive regulation that supports, the industry's development versus, and again, this is crypto. There's CeFi and DeFi. Hmm. Even as an industry, centralized finance is essential to the industry's development, right? You need on-ramps and off-ramps. You need banks that interact. You need, ability to make traditional payments, receive payments, traditional payment infrastructure. And then you've got DeFi, which is a whole different thing. And that's what we really care about, is that DeFi is continually recognized as non-custodial sort of infrastructure, and it shouldn't be regulated in the same way as custodial agents. When you are responsible for holding other people's assets, we want some rules. This is what's happened. If you are holding other people's keys and holding onto their money, there's a reason we have a bunch of regulations here, because we want to hold people accountable, responsible, that are holding your money on your behalf and screw up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's DeFi, and hopefully as you learn, understand not your keys, not your coins. So it's not singular. We're an evolving industry.
And to your point, it seems like there's a merge of, some of these centralized exchanges are building a decentralized arm where they have the non-custodial wallets, but you can use the platform, and there's synergy there, right? Very easy to go between the two. So it seems, to your point, that's going to be a big model to onboard the next billion users, because not everybody's going to be straight up self-custody. It's going to be hard for them. And not everybody's tech savvy. They come from different walks of life, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Going back to the SEC, what are your thoughts on the recent ruling around the Ripple lawsuit? Ripple getting a partial victory, but I think a big one, where XRP intrinsically was declared not a security. So it goes back to the oranges in the Howey test. Now, the orange grows are not securities, but how they're packaged. I think that's a key distinction. And the secondary market sales, I think it's very important for the entire altcoin market. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm surprised we haven't seen the markets respond more favorably. I think it's a big precedent, and a positive precedent, something that could have kicked off an alt bull. Right? But we haven't seen that. So the market obviously hasn't responded, because it is a mixed bag. It's not all good, right? There's some good stuff that came out of this, but Ripple Labs is not off the hook in terms of how they took in capital institutionally and otherwise. How big those fines might end up being, there's still some overhang and the potential to challenge the rulings, right? It's not done yet. I'd say this is a really favorable event, something that I think bodes well for the overall industry, but it's not conclusive just yet. And I would have thought the markets would have responded more positively.
Yeah, I mean, part of it, to your point, there still has to be like a settlement talk, if I'm not mistaken, and figuring out some.
Yeah, there's still some big loose ends here, and they're not minor.
Right.
Though it's called, they haven't won the war, but this was a major victory in terms of winning a battle. And it isn't over yet.
Right. And it seems like we were talking about crypto regulations and bills. Many folks in Congress are taking this ruling and saying, okay, we got to act now. As you can see, there's still a lot of confusion in the market. So hopefully this builds some momentum to get the regulations through, and we'll see what happens. I want to go back and talk about Self real quick, because you were talking about, data privacy and so forth. One of the things I've been discussing is the ability for us to tokenize our identity on the blockchain, and then potentially choosing who we sell that to. There's a market for that, and we can monetize that. Do you see a future with that in place?
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole, I did a TEDx talk on Web 2, Web 3, and the short strokes are that, kind of Web 1 was, we have this view of what the internet could do to democratize information and build a better world. Web 2 is the system got captured by big tech. Web 3 is the demonopolization of big tech. Right? Big tech, the main commodity in the world for a long time was gold. Then it became oil. Now it's your data, your digital DNA. So instead of Facebook and all of these companies, being the FANG companies, right? They've always gone by FANG, being the vampires that are, sucking all your digital DNA out of you without you even knowing what and where and how it's being used, and taking all of the value that is accreted from it. I think Web 3 is one where you have more control over your data, your digital identity, right? Your digital DNA, where you can say, delete that, move that here, and we're going to move around to systems that actually, where we are a beneficiary of our own data. And so I think that's what Web 3 ultimately holds. And I think Web3 is going to cannibalize Web2 in a world where we become economic participants. I think this may be the solution to what you'd call universal basic income. But the idea that if everybody is, participating in the value that they create through the use of the internet and the monetization of their data, even if they're only getting 30% of it, maybe then one day we get 70% of it, who knows, right? That, might be enough where even in places that have low income, you might get $1 a day, right? This has the potential to create, really meaningful change. And I know I'm just waiting for a good enough product or service to emerge that, can replace the Twitters, the TikToks. By the way, I love what Elon has done. So, we'll leave Twitter off that list because I think hopefully with X.com, he's going to do that on his own, but to replace, all of your current big tech. And, they have for them the same opportunity that, Charles Schwab did when, stockbrokers became, like E-Trade. Remember, big companies can survive these transitions, but they usually have to have the courage to cannibalize their existing business model, which is very hard. Certainly for executives. Executives aren't willing to take that kind of risk usually.
A few more questions because I know you got to go. What are your thoughts on WorldCoin? As we were talking about data privacy, and they want to scan your eye and put your data on the blockchain, and they're looking to solve a bit of the UBI problem. What are your thoughts on that project?
I mean, conceptually, I like some of the things as I've just mentioned or referenced, and then the currency is always the devil is in the details.
Yeah,
right. And if you don't want the devil to beat you, you have to be in the details. Right. And you understand that data, back to privacy. And are you happy with how that's being done? But conceptually, I think the idea of, these things are going to happen. And so we have to decide and be discerning in terms of which products and services do we want to win. And you vote with your wallet. In this case, you vote with your eyes and you vote with your feet. And so make sure you're voting in terms of who and where you participate.
Now let's talk about the metaverse really quick, because you mentioned it earlier. Web 1.0 could have been Metaverse 1.0 in gaming and the way things were transacted there. And there's been an evolution, and now there's a move to be more immersive, which includes a full token digital economy, NFTs, and so forth. Zuck has tried his hand at it, losing billions of dollars. It's still early. What are your thoughts? When do you think we hit that tipping point where it's not as hard for the consumer to be immersed and it's quality? It doesn't look like a cartoon.
Fortnite and these things have already existed. Remember, metaverses, massively multiplayer games, virtual worlds have been around for decades. It just goes by a new name every decade, track new capital. And so ultimately these are immersive environments that have to have, linear and non-linear entertainment and the ability to create, sort of content. I think a lot of the first wave of what we'd call metaverses, thought this is a new category. It's not entirely. They rush to market. It's like making movies. Entertainment. It's got to be entertaining. It's got to be engaging. And so the majority of projects fail just due to the nature of getting it right. I think it's happening. Do I think it's going to happen as quickly as some people think? No. I think it's going to take a while. And you've got the web version, call it the spatial web. And then you're going to have, like Oculuses, and your, virtual headsets are not ubiquitously distributed everywhere. Right. This is not an overnight thing. But I think it's an industry that, it is inevitable. It is the future, but I don't think this is, going to happen as quickly as some people think. Though the winners are likely going to be established soon. The companies or the groups of people that ultimately do build the really successful stuff in this area, are probably working on things right now, even if it will be 5 or 10 years before the winner's decided.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. Got to ask you about Blockone and EOS. Any updates there? Is the project kind of stalled? Any plans to merge it with another project or whatever it may be?
I'd say the project isn't stalled. I think the project is making actually a lot of progress on many fronts. I've paused. I was obviously very involved in EOS and its creation and its launching and otherwise and supporting it. But I took all of my shares in Block One, and did a deal to convert all of that value, which is like 9 figures, and converted it to EOS, a deal that converted it to EOS tokens. And I did that because it didn't feel right to me and to not win with my community. And so, it's kind of ride or die.
Sure.
And so I did that as the deal that I had put together, and, it didn't really come together in the way that I'd like. And, you can only do so much. I'd say I'm not aware of anyone that's ever done anything like that. I don't know people that are willing to take that much risk to, be in the same boat as a community. And, the community, or at least some part of it, and some of, call it the other influential players, we couldn't come to consensus around what to do. And so I made an announcement in April, on April 1st, that, I was going to take a step back from the community, which conveniently is April Fool's, meaning I've kind of left the door open to go either way. And, just kind of waiting to see what the community does. I'm very focused on things like universal peace and the Dollar Donation Club and a lot of impact things, lots of foundations, all sorts of infrastructure around the world. And, I'm focused on the world's biggest problems. And there's great things going on at EOS, though. The question is it going to be enough? Is it a day late, a dollar short? Clearly almost the entire industry, not Bitcoin, but pretty much anything that runs on a delegated proof of stake type architecture, right? Anything DPoS, which is anything that's not proof of work, anything that's basically proof of stake, all runs on the EOS framework, including Ethereum. So it's very sad. We got it all right, but there were some issues in the execution and implementation, and there's a number of reasons that worked out the way that it did. Part of it is $4.2 billion and government. The US government took a very serious interest in what we were doing, which makes being nimble very hard. You're under a magnifying glass, and legal has to sign off on everything. It's very hard. But we're collectively making progress as an overall industry. And my view has always been, if anyone succeeds in making the world a better place, we all win. So I support and encourage innovation all over.
Got some wrap-up questions here for you. If you could create your own metaverse, what would the theme be? Where would Brock go to?
Back when I played, in MMORPGs, I really enjoyed the fantasy genre. So, the EverQuests and the World of Warcrafts and these things were sort of the ones that I liked most. But the sci-fi stuff, the Star Wars worlds are not, that bad. I'm not a big fan of like simulated current reality to play in. I'm happy to play in this reality. I don't need to go into a metaverse to imitate this world. I'd rather go, Lord of the Rings kind of, or something of that nature. Though, it's probably fantasy.
Cool. I got some rapid fire questions here.
Oh, more dragons.
What's that? More dragons.
More dragons.
For sure. All right, got some rapid fire questions here for you. Favorite food?
Japanese.
Favorite musician or band?
These days it's all sort of shamanic house or like electronic sort of music. I'm here in Ibiza right now.
Oh, very nice. Favorite movie?
Oh, it's, again, I grew up in the film business. Favorites. It's kind of like it's what theme, when, and now. I've been having a lot of fun with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly this week, and kind of that old theme song. I remember I make movies. I produce films, so it's like asking someone who their favorite child is.
Oh, sure. By the way, I literally watched The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly again 2 weeks ago. It's just great.
By the way, speaking of this, I'll go with Ready Player One.
Ready Player One.
You're talking about metaverses, right?
Yeah.
Go watch that. And my family office is called Percival.
Favorite book?
Right now, I'm just going to go with stuff that I've been quoting the last few days, which would be the some of the quotes of Edmond Dantes and the Count of Monte Cristo. Mm-hmm. But again, there's so many great books.
And when you're not doing anything crypto related,
actually, let's go with Superhuman. I was hanging out with Dave Asprey the last 5 days. He just took off today, and really diving into our longevity work. Like, if I wanted to talk about something, or the 4 agreements, is also some really, great things from a personal sort of self-improvement perspective, both in terms of your health, mind, call it body and soul.
Mm. And when you're not working, what are you doing for fun as pastime? Maybe it's, playing video games or something along those lines.
Well, I don't know the difference between work and play. I've so blurred the lines that it's one the same.
Brock, pleasure chatting with you, man. And I appreciate all the great things you're doing in DC and helping to advocate for crypto and educating folks. And certainly you've been following you for a long time. So it was an absolute pleasure chatting with you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.